Okay, so last time we saw the death of Sarah at 127 years old, and remember Abraham went through that sort of formalized negotiation to buy the cave of Machpelah as a burial place, and then we looked at that story about Abraham's servant and just that amazing answer to prayer uh, with Rebekah there at the well. Um,
Wait a minute. We found the story of Abraham's death.
are you on the Genesis 25?
Oh. Nope.
See, believe it or not, I've already
You've already gone
done the
ahead.
next lesson.
Let's see.
So the servant came back with Rebekah, and you know, should I? Yeah, I will. And we know from that story what brand of cigarettes that Rebekah smoked, because it says that when she saw Isaac, she lit off her camel, but only in the King James. Anyway, so now in chapter 25, it says, I'm sorry, this should be the end of 24. Shouldn't, no, I guess it is at the beginning of 25. Abraham took another wife whose name was Keturah. She bore him Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua. And then Jokshan fathered Sheba and Dedan. The sons of Dedan were Ashhurim, Letushim, Leumim. And the sons of Midian were Ephah, Epher, Hanoch, Abidah, and Eldah. All these were the children of Keturah. There's a bunch of names here, and most of them aren't really of any significance for our purposes. I did, for completeness' sake, put the names of the meanings of the names in the notes. But a few of them stand out. Midian became the progenitor of the, guess what? The Midianites. And they lived in the Sinai and in the northern Arabian Peninsula. Well, they're kind of, the reason they're significant to the story is because after Moses killed the Egyptian, and he was afraid, this thing is known, then he fled to Midian, and he ended up herding the sheep of this guy Jethro, who was a Midianite, and then he took a Midianite wife. And he was in Midian when God first spoke to him at the burning bush. And you can read all about that in Exodus 2, chapter 2 and chapter 3. And then later on, when the Israelites were coming back up after their wandering in the wilderness, the Midianites and the Moabites would not allow them to pass. And Israel defeated the Midianites. You can read about that in Numbers 22 and 25 and 31. And then later on, years later, Gideon defeated the Midianites with an army of only 300. You can read about that in Judges 6 through 8.
Old Abraham did pretty good for a 100-year-old man.
Yeah, not too bad with his new second wife, right? I think there are 8 of them there or something like that. So Sheba is a commonly reused name, and this Sheba here should not be confused with the Queen of Sheba. She was descended from Ham through Cush, and not from this Sheba who was Abraham's son by Keturah. Remember that Abraham and those that were descended from him were all descended from Shem, not Ham, Noah's son Shem. Dedan is another name that's reused. It's mentioned here as a grandson of Abraham, but it should not be confused with the Dedan that we saw in Genesis 10, who was also a grandson of Noah. And we'll look a little bit, just briefly, at the maps where these people ended up. Dedan figures in the prophecies of Jeremiah and Ezekiel, and especially in the prophecy that we looked at in Ezekiel 38, the invasion of Gog of Magog. Dedan is one of the names that's mentioned there. That Dedan is the people descended from Noah's grandson. Now, by the way, if you look at the sons of Dedan here in this, where is it, verse 3, notice that those all end in I am. All those names end in I am. Those are peoples, not individual names. They're plural names, if you will. So, like the Goyim, right? Gentiles. So, continuing on in verse 5, Abraham gave all that he had to Isaac, but to the sons of his concubines he gave gifts. While he was still living, he sent them away from his son Isaac, eastward to the east country. Now, Abraham knew that God had, remember, Abraham had tried to say, oh, that Ishmael might live before you, right? And God was adamant. No, through Isaac will this promise be fulfilled, the promise of the Messiah to come. And Abraham knew that, and so he wanted to sort of put a buffer between Isaac and all of his other sons. And that's why he sent them away. But he did provide an inheritance for them, as he says here.
Okay, it says he took a wife whose name was Keturah. And then down there he said he gave gifts to his concubines.
Who we don't have listed, right?
Yeah.
Yep. Of course, I don't know, would you consider Hagar his wife?
Or a porcupine.
A porcupine.
Well, he evidently didn't give anything to his
To Ishmael.
Sons by Keturah. She was his wife.
Yep.
Unless she was considered a porcupine.
Hard to say, but it says that he gave, it's kind of, I would say, contradictory. It says he gave everything to Isaac, and then it says, but he did give gifts to these others, right? So, anyway, in verse 7, it says, these are the days of the years of Abraham's life, 175 years. Abraham breathed his last and died in a good old age, an old man and full of years, and was gathered to his people. Isaac and Ishmael, his sons, buried him in the cave of Machpelah in the field of Ephron, the son of Zohar the Hittite, east of Mamre, the field that Abraham purchased from the Hittites. There Abraham was buried with his wife Sarah, his wife. After the death of Abraham, God blessed Isaac, his son, and Isaac settled at Be'er Lahai Roi. I still think that's very ironic, since Be'er Lahai Roi is where Hagar first found out that she was pregnant with Ishmael, right? So after 14 chapters, we've been following Abraham for 14 chapters now. It's kind of amazing. We finally get to the end of his life. He was called to leave Haran when he was 75 years old and travel to Canaan. And he lived in Canaan. Apart from that brief sojourn down in Egypt, he lived in Canaan for a century. What's up with her? And during that time, he was very prosperous, of course, but he didn't own any land in Canaan. He lived in tents that whole time as a sojourner in Canaan, apart from the cave of Machpelah and the field and the trees that went with it. But he did believe the promise that God gave him to give the land of Canaan as a possession for his descendants. And we saw there in Genesis 15 that God credited that belief to him as righteousness. Now, this story of Abraham provides us with an answer to a very challenging question that you may have been asked. What about these people in the Old Testament that died without ever hearing the gospel of Jesus Christ, since Jesus Christ hadn't been born yet? But we get an answer in the case of Abraham. There are several instances of this, but one of the teachings of Jesus that leads me to believe this was Jesus' answer to the Sadducees. You remember they gave him that convoluted question about, well, so what if a guy marries this woman and then he dies and he has 7 brothers and all of them end up married to her because they all die in a row? Whose wife is she in the resurrection? Well, of course, the Sadducees didn't believe that there was any such thing as a resurrection, so it was kind of I guess disingenuous at the best for them to be even asking the question. But he responded to them in Mark 12, verse 26. He says, "And as for the dead being raised, have you not read in the book of Moses, in the passage about the bush, how God spoke to him, saying, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob? He is not the God of the dead, but of the living. You are quite wrong." So exactly how that happens, because for those of us who were born after Jesus, the way we get saved is we believe in our hearts in his resurrection, and we confess with our mouth his lordship, right? That's how we are saved. And then in response to that, he seals us with his Spirit. So how did he deal with these other guys who were faithful believers, but no way they could confess Jesus as Lord, since Jesus had not been born yet, right? So there, you'll see it preached that during the 2 days that he was in the grave, he went down to Hades and he preached the gospel to these guys, and they, some of them chose to believe and some of them didn't, right? I think that's actually still Catholic doctrine, isn't it?
Yeah, it's in the Douay Bible.
Yep.
I just always, just like Abraham, it was credited righteous because he believed God.
Mm-hmm.
For those up until the time Jesus came, those who placed their faith in what God had, the means that God had provided for them,
and the promise of the Mashiach.
The blood of sheep and goats and all that cannot take away sin, but faith, putting your faith in what God has said he would do, is what takes away sin.
Mm-hmm.
Who was in the burning bush?
Yeah. There's no doubt that Jesus was alive at the very beginning.
They were exposed to Jesus a long time before we were.
And Paul talks about the name above all names. I think the name above all names is the one that you read about in Revelation, the Word of God. Right? It was him who spoke the word. I mean, there's no doubt that Jesus was there. He just wasn't there for people to, recognize, I guess, is the word.
See, I mean, we take the assumption that it was the Father.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe it was not just the Father in this.
Well, what did he say? He said, "Let us make man in our image." No doubt Jesus was there at the very beginning, and I don't know. I guess there are a lot of people. There are a lot of ostensible Christians that don't believe in the doctrine of the Trinity, but I guess the Mormons, for example, don't believe in the doctrine of the Trinity, even though they believe in Jesus, but they don't believe he's God. Right? Anyway, to me, Jesus' own teachings about Abraham belie this whole idea that he went down to Hades and preached the gospel to them after they died. The example that springs to mind is the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, where the Lazarus was in Abraham's bosom, right? But there are others. But exactly how God made this provision, Who knows? And I think probably Randy's quite right about that. It was their faith in the promise, not the faith in the incarnation that they hadn't seen yet. They had the promise of the incarnation, right? Anyway, we may never know the answer even when we're in glory, and we probably certainly won't care what the answer is. Anyway, in verse 12 it says, these are the generations of Ishmael. Now, I've been promising to read these to you for a while, right? Remember when Hagar was booted out finally after Ishmael made fun of Isaac, God appeared to her again and said that, he was going to bless Ishmael as well, and that from him 12 princes would come. And then finally now we're coming to that list of princes. These are the generations of Ishmael, Abraham's son, whom Hagar, the Egyptian, Sarah's servant, bore to Abraham. These are the names of the sons of Ishmael, named in the order of their birth. And I'm going to do my best here. Nebaioth, the firstborn of Ishmael, and Kedar, Abdeel, Mibsham, Mishma, Duma, Massa, Hadad, Tema, Yetur, Naphish, and Kedema. These are the sons of Ishmael, and these are their names by their villages and by their encampments, 12 princes according to their tribes. These are the years of the life of Ishmael, 137 years. He breathed his last and died and was gathered to his people. They settled from Havilah to Shur, which is opposite Egypt. And if you remember, Egypt is, the Hebrew there is Mishraim. And in some English language translations, it's just simply transliterated Misraim, and in other places, or other translations, it's translated as Egypt. Anyway, from Havilah to Shur, which is opposite Egypt in the direction of Assyria. Well, Assyria is northeast of Egypt. He settled over against all his kinsmen. So now remember, even until the year before Isaac was born, Abraham was still trying to promote Ishmael as the plan B for these for his descendants to inherit the land of Canaan. But God was adamant that Isaac was the son of promise. But he did say that he would bless Ishmael. He said that to his mother Hagar, and that he would be the father of 12 princes. And of these 12, only 6 of them are mentioned elsewhere outside of the genealogies. Nebaioth is mentioned specifically in Genesis 28 as the brother of Esau's wife, Mahalath. Well, if he was the brother of Mahalath, then the other 11 were her brother as well, right? But only Nebaioth is mentioned. Now, the capital city of his descendants was what is now Petra, the rock city that Indiana Jones visited much later on. I assume you've all seen the Temple of Doom.
Yeah.
No, it's not Temple of Doom.
Yeah, sorry.
Of course, just because the name's the same, I mean.
Yep.
It's
They,
like,
they recycle their names in a big
well,
way.
I mean, that's no different. I mean, now
Yep.
it isn't recycling. It's just
If we talk
one
about
person's called by that name.
we talk about John,
Yeah.
John who?
Which John?
Yep.
You know, in my high school accounting class, there were 13 students. 3 of us were named Sue.
So Kedar is also mentioned outside of the genealogies. He's mentioned in Isaiah, and you can look at the references where that's found. He's mentioned in Jeremiah, and he's mentioned in Ezekiel. All of them foretell the downfall of Kedar's descendants, who were Bedouins living in the Arabian Peninsula. Duma is mentioned in the prophecy of Isaiah in association with the downfall of Edom, which we don't know this yet, but Edom is another name for Esau. Tema Tema is mentioned in Isaiah and Jeremiah in conjunction with prophecies against the people of Arabia. Yetur and Naphish, the descendants of these two sons of Ishmael, were defeated by Gad, Reuben, and the half-tribe of Manasseh before the Israelites went went over the Jordan. All right, and if you remember, they had those three tribes, 2.5 tribes, went to Moses and asked if they might have their inheritance there in the lands of these two descendants of Ishmael that are the descendants of Ishmael's two sons. And Moses said, yes, you can take your inheritance here, but you're going to have to come up with us into Canaan and help us defeat the people that are there. Then you can come back and take your inheritance here. That's all in Numbers. No, it's in Joshua, and it wasn't Moses that said it. It was Joshua that said it. Or it might have been Moses.
Moses died at the end.
It was Joshua, I think.
At the beginning of Joshua.
Right, but I can't remember if these battles east of the Jordan happened before Moses died or not.
Yeah, I think they did, because the first thing that happens after Moses dies and Joshua takes over is they cross the Jordan.
Mm-hmm. Well, the first thing that happens is this dude, the commander of the army of God, appears to Joshua. Guess who that was? Man, I'm telling you, that study last night, I can't wait for that trump and that shout and that voice of the archangel and that white horse a coming. Yeah. Anyway, by the way, Yetur's land included Bashan, which is called today the Golan Heights. So before we press on here, I want to take a closer look at verse 18 here. It says, they settled, and that word is Sakan, from Havilah to Shur, which is opposite Egypt, in the direction of Assyria. Now, if you remember from Genesis 16, God told Hagar that she was pregnant with Ishmael, and in that passage, I've got a water bottle if you'd like. In that passage, we found two distinct Hebrew words that were translated as against. Do any of you guys remember that?
Yeah.
And the first one was just two words. We don't even know how, or two letters. We don't even know an English equivalent or even a Hebrew meaning of those two letters. At least Strong's doesn't. But the second of those was the word panim. And here in 25:18, we find that again translated as against, over against all his kinsmen. But remember, when we looked at Genesis 16, I said that there were some English language translations that had, in my opinion, mistranslated panim. They translated it as in hostility toward or in defiance of. And it's the same thing with some translations here in Genesis 25:18. They translate, the New Living Translation, the NIV, and the NASB all translate panim as in hostility toward. Might be, anyway, they mistranslate them again, I think. Now, why do I say that they're mistranslating? And it comes from these two separate words that are translated as settled. The first of these was sakan, if you'll remember. And that's in, at the beginning of the verse, it says, they settled from Havilah to Shur. That word settled there is sakan. And it does... Oh, my phone is in here somewhere. And indeed, it does mean to abide, to dwell, to reside, or to settle. But the second one that's translated as settled is Napal. And that's at the very end of the verse. It says, he settled over against all his kinsmen. Right? Well, that word, Napal, means to fall or to lie prostrate. Well, guess what? What are we talking about? His death. Yeah, he fell down and he lay down. Right? We might well expect him to have, when he died, to have had fallen down prostrate. But being dead, it would have been very, very hard for him to be in defiance of or in opposition to anything at all, right? So that's why I think they mistranslate panim there. And what I think this really means is that he lay down and died in the presence of his family, as well he should have, right? But I'll leave that to you all. So let's look at this map very briefly. There's not a whole lot of reason to look at it, but we'll look at it just briefly. Okay, so you may recall this Descendants of Ham map, and the reason I wanted to look at it was these down here in the western part of the Arabian Peninsula. Let me try to zoom out a little bit here. Remember we looked at those names, Sheba and Dedan, right? This is where they settled, along the western coast of the eastern coast of the Red Sea. Let's just put it that way. Southwestern coast of Arabia. Now, this guy right here says Havilah, right? You remember Havilah was one of the names that was mentioned in Genesis 10. Let's go to the other map real quick just for GPs. Throughout the Genesis, we're told about in the direction towards Shur, right? And this road right here was called the way to Shur. But nobody knows where Shur was, except for, as it says,
It's on that road.
it was east of Egypt in the direction of Assyria, right? So it's somewhere in the Sinai, but we really don't know where. And those were the only reasons I really wanted to come to this map, or to these maps. There we go. Now, Havilah. Nobody knows where Havilah was. We have seen that name before, right? In Genesis 10 and also in Genesis 2. It talks about how Havilah was a place that had very fine gold, right? And the river Pishon that flowed out of Eden flowed around this land of Havilah, right? But since there's been a flood in the meantime, we don't know where Eden was, we don't know where Pishon was, and we don't know where Esau or Havilah was, which is a shame because apparently it has very high quality gold. Anyway, in verse 19, these are the generations of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham fathered Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel, the Aramean of Padan Aram, the sister of Laban, the Aramean, to be his wife. And Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife because she was barren, and the Lord granted his prayer, and Rebekah, his wife, conceived. Now, once again, we see a recurring theme in the Bible, particularly in the Old Testament, of infertility. Bunches of examples of this. One of these two babies that Rebekah's got in her body is going to have an issue with infertility in his family. That's going to lead to some shenanigans. In virtually all ancient cultures, whenever a couple was childless, the fault was assumed to lie with the woman, right? And Sarai, when you think about it, when she couldn't conceive, right? She never considered the possibility that Abraham might be at fault, right? That he might be impotent, right? She said, "Here, take my Egyptian, take my Egyptian slay, no, give me, and she will give me, I will have children by her, is what she said. It never occurred to her that Abraham might not be able to impregnate Hagar either. It was a shameful thing for a woman to not be able to have children, and infertile women were shunned by the other women as if infertility was some kind of communicable disease, right? And then everybody talked about how, well, what did she do? Why did God curse her this way? Right? And the woman herself would do that. Why am I cursed with infidelity? And guess what? Still happening right up to today. So here in this passage, we find an example of how we should respond to infertility, right? It says that, and Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife because she was barren, and the Lord granted his prayer, and Rebekah, his wife, conceived. Unfortunately, instead of going to the Lord as our first, option, we always exhaust all the other avenues that we possibly can before we cry out in desperation, right? And we forget that God is always sovereign, that whatever is happening, it is in accordance with God's will, and his will is always good for those that love him and are called in accordance with his purpose. We forget that, so we don't go seeking him to help us. And really, the other thing that we forget is no matter what we do, it will be pointless and be ineffective unless it's God's will anyway, right? And so what we need to do is keep plugged in and seek him in prayer and search for him in his word. He says that if you seek me with all of your heart, I will be found by you. So Isaac here gives us a good example. And that reminded me of Jesus saying in John, he said, I am the vine, you are the branches, whoever abides in me and I in him, he it is that bears much fruit, for apart from me, you can do nothing. So continuing in verse 22, he says, the children struggled together within her, and she said, if it is thus, why is this happening to me? Other translations say, if all is well, why is this happening? So she went to inquire of the Lord. Good, right? And the Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other. The older shall serve the younger. And we'll look at this prophecy being fulfilled pretty much for about the next quarter of the book of Genesis. We'll see various ways that this is being fulfilled. And really, not just Genesis, on into the history of the Israelites. So God blessed Isaac's plea for Rebekah to conceive, and he also honored Rebekah when she looked for his counsel and his reassurance. But notice that God did not heal what was going on inside her womb, right? He just told her what was going on, and he made this amazing prophecy so that she could have some peace of mind about it. Now, the common narrative that's taught in our schools and promulgated on our media and by our governments is that this conflict that's going on in Canaan right now between the Israelis and the Palestinians started in 1947 when the state of Israel was, 1948, when the state of Israel was created by UN mandate, basically. And Palestine was divided in accordance with that mandate. And by the way, one of the things that's just really aggravates me is the UN plan, and it wasn't a mandate, it was a resolution. Right? The plan was to divide Palestine between Palestinian Arabs that were living in the area and Jews, including Zionist Jews that were already living there, and other Jews that were coming from Europe and pretty much everywhere around the world after the Holocaust. All right. That division, the lines of that division, if you look at the map, and I don't think I put that map in this lesson. I might have. Those lines that were in that UN resolution are virtually identical to the lines that exist today between the Palestinian Authority land and the Israeli land. But the Jordanians and the Syrians and the Egyptians and the Saudi Arabians were not willing, and the Lebanese were not willing to accept it. And there's been all this struggle ever since. But it didn't start then. It started right here in Rebekah's womb. Anyway, I could wax eloquent about that for a while. One of these children, Jacob, who was later renamed Israel, would have 12 sons through 4 different wives, and those were the ones that became the progenitors of the tribes of Israel. Esau was later renamed Edom, and we'll look at why next time. He occupied much of the area that is now southern Jordan and the northern Sinai. So basically part of Egypt at the time of in 1948 when the state of Israel was created. And the Esau's descendants were partially the people that eventually became the people that we now know as the Palestinians. And this conflict between Edom and the Israelites is found throughout the Old Testament. We'll see a bunch of it in Genesis and then more later. I think you found a friend. Don't let him suckle, though. Okay? And that it features prominently in prophecy as well. Some of the prophecies, as Randy pointed out last night, have already been fulfilled, and some of them remain for the future. This trouble is not going to end until till Jesus returns and rules with a rod of iron for 1,000 years. Then this conflict will end. Anyway, in verse 24, when her days to give birth were completed, behold, there were twins in her womb. The first came out red, all his body like a hairy cloak. So they called his name Esau, which means hairy. And Edom, by the way, means red. Afterward, his brother came out with his hand holding Esau's heel. So his name was called Jacob, which means heel holder or supplanter. Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. So remember, Isaac was married when he was 40. So they'd been married for 20 years when these two twins were born. Now, this is the only mention. This is the first mention of twins at all, and it's the only mention of human twins apart from a brief, what you would call mention in passing. In John, he talks about Thomas, who was also called the twin, right? Didymus. So now with the death of Abraham and the birth of these two twins, we're going from the third part of Genesis, the third major part of Genesis, which is the life of Abraham and Isaac, and into the fourth part, which is centered around the life of Jacob. And we're also going one more step along the line from Adam to the Mashiach, right? Remember in Genesis 3, we got the first promise of the one to come who would let's see, what does it say? You shall bruise his heel, the serpent shall bruise his heel, but he shall crush your head. And then we've been following that through Adam and Eve's son Seth, to Noah's son Shem, to Abraham's son Isaac, and now finally to Jacob and the establishment of the nation of Israel. So, I'm sorry?
The people of Israel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's funny because Israel means a bunch of different things depending on the context, right? Our tour guide in Israel was very, very... He actually started that on the first day. He mentioned that, and he said, Israel means a bunch of things. It means Jacob himself, right? It means the Israelites, right? It means Israel as in believers, right? Of Jewish and and Gentile. And it means the state of Israel, the modern state of Israel. And so throughout our tour, he was careful to always, when he was talking about modern Israel, he always talked about the state of Israel versus the nation of Israel, right? Anyway, Jacob and Rebekah are two names. Many names have symbolic meaning, but with these two, it's quite apparent. And Esau as well. We'll look at the significance of his hairiness in chapter 27, when Isaac is giving his blessing. And I said dying blessing here, but Isaac didn't die for another 20 years after this. But he was old and he couldn't see. Anyway, we'll be reminded then of the significance of Esau's name, hairy, and Rebekah, Rebekah's name, which means ensnarer, and Jacob's name, which means heel catcher or supplanter. So
Harry.
Yep.
That's his name.
Yeah, Harry. And he had two brothers, Tom and Dick. Anyway, so before we close, we'll just go real quickly into this story. Verse 27, when the boys grew up, Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, while Jacob was a quiet man, dwelling in tents. So he was an inside boy, someone that I can relate to. Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. This is tragic. It really is. When parents allow themselves to have favorites among their children. And it's particularly tragic when the father's favorite is different from the mother's favorite, as it is here. It leads to all kinds of trouble, just like we're going to see with these two. And it's really kind of shameful, too, that Esau was his favorite because he brought him food that he liked, right? Anyway, that this playing favorites between Isaac and Jacob and Rebekah and Esau, it has impacted not just their family and not just the people in Canaan. It's had a worldwide impact from then until now.
And then Jacob turned around and played.
Did the same thing. Yep. Yep. We don't. We're kind of slow learners. Mm-hmm. But it's a cautionary tale. Don't play favorites with your children. Enjoy them for who they are. They're absolutely unique. Mm-hmm. What I like to say about mine is, when Christian came out, he was going, and I thought there was something wrong with him. And he goes, what's wrong with him? And doctor said, well, nothing wrong with him. He just doesn't want to inconvenience anybody, right? Jeremy came out. He was screaming bloody murder from the instant he came out. He didn't like it. It was cold out there. He was hungry. He didn't like it at all. And they've kind of followed down the line with those two ways of attacking life. But we just need to, as parents, we need to savor the unique character of our children and certainly not play favorites among them.
and grandchildren.
And grandchildren,
If any.
if any. So, so this is a day of independence for all the Munchkins and their descendants, if any. So in verse 29, once when Jacob was cooking stew, Esau came in from the field, and he was exhausted. And Esau said to Jacob, "Let me eat some of that red stew, for I'm exhausted." Well, now we find out why he was called red. Therefore his name was called Edom, which means red. Jacob said, "Sell me your birthright now." Esau said, "I am about to die. Of what use is a birthright to me?" Jacob said, "Swear to me now." So he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew, and he ate and drank and rose and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. Now, in ancient Hebrew culture, traditionally, the firstborn son, forget the daughters, the firstborn son had a place of honor among the children and received a double portion of the inheritance. The fathers, what they did for a last will and testament was the father would give a blessing upon his sons near the end of his life and pronounce this inheritance, if you will. This has special significance, as we'll see in the case of Esau and Jacob. It wasn't codified in the law of Moses, this tradition. The only mention of it in the law is in Deuteronomy 21, where it talks about if a man has more than one wife, he will not give double honor to the later wife, even if he loves her more, right? Speaking of Jacob, right? We'll get into that soon with Laban, the Old Testament's used car salesman and the what do they call that? Something and switch, bait and switch, right? Anyway, you're not to give the double portion inheritance to the firstborn of the second wife, even if the first wife is less loved. But that wasn't put into the law until hundreds of years later. But this tradition would become significant when it came time for Jacob. That's a typo. That should read Isaac. For Isaac to bless his own. Sorry, it isn't a typo. It's when Jacob blessed his sons. It'll become significant again, just as it is when Isaac blessed his sons. Now, having said all that, throughout the Word of God, they have either ignored or modified this tradition in various times, and oftentimes with undesirable results. Jacob's own... I'm sorry?
I was just going to say, with Abraham's sons,
yeah,
God basically directed him to ignore that.
Ishmael was the firstborn, that's correct. When Jacob went to bless his sons, the second youngest son, Joseph, received the double portion. So he was the 11th son. And he did that by virtue of his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. Each received a portion as grandchildren, right? Instead of Joseph. Let's see. King David wasn't the firstborn of Jesse's sons. In fact, he was the youngest. And when David died, he gave the kingdom, although God had already determined to take it away. Sorry, that was later on when Solomon died. David gave the kingdom to Solomon, but Solomon had many older brothers. I didn't count them, but there were a bunch. And furthermore, this little conversation between Esau and Jacob over the stew was a private conversation, even though Esau sold his birthright to Jacob, right? It could have been a he said, she said, right? because nobody witnessed this.
How do you know that? How do you know that?
Well, we don't know that, but what we're going to find out is that Rebekah and Jacob pulled a little trick to make double sure it happened the way that they had planned. Remember that Jacob was Rebekah's favorite. So next time we'll talk about that when the boys come of age, and then in Isaac's declining years, Jacob and Rebekah cook up this plan to make sure that Jacob gets the blessing instead of Esau. And that, by the way, would be just another step along this conflict between these two that continues until this day. Now, what we'll find is that Esau and Jacob kiss and make up eventually, but really only temporarily, only for that generation. Later on, when the Israelites came back from Egypt, it bubbled up again, and it's been bubbling up again ever since, really.